Hi guys, tonight we're going back to one of the most devastating and least talked about disasters of the 20th century, the Banqiao Dam collapse in China. Imagine a wall of water so vast it swallowed entire towns overnight, a catastrophe hidden for years behind silence and censorship. This is not just a story about a dam, it's about human ambition, nature's revenge, and the fragile line between control and chaos. If you appreciate calm, reflective journeys through forgotten times, don't forget to tap like, subscribe, and share in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing where these stories are reaching, and tell me, what hidden story should we uncover together next? The story begins in the heart of China's Henan province, in a time when the country was rebuilding itself after years of turmoil. It was the 1950s, and China's leadership was determined to harness nature, to control rivers that had flooded for centuries. Under Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, hundreds of dams were ordered to be built across the nation. The Banqiao Dam, designed to tame the mighty Ru River, was one of the largest and most ambitious. Engineers, inspired by the Soviet model of progress, promised that the structure would stand against any storm. They called it the Iron Dam, a symbol of modern strength and human triumph. The Banqiao project started with optimism. Soviet specialists assisted in design, bringing their expertise and blueprints. The dam was meant to withstand what they called a once-in-a-thousand-years flood. It stood 118 meters high, built from clay and stone, reinforced with modern technology for the time. The workers who built it worked through nights and rains, driven by pride and propaganda posters promising a brighter, flood-free future. By 1952, the dam stood completed, holding back billions of cubic meters of water. Nearby, the Shimantan Dam and a chain of smaller dams were built to create a network of protection, a web meant to make the region flood-proof. But progress came with hidden cracks. Some engineers warned that the quality of materials wasn't ideal, that the speed of construction, demanded by political deadlines, had compromised safety. Yet few dared to speak out. In that era, questioning authority could be seen as disloyalty. Reports of minor leaks and structural weaknesses were quietly dismissed. On paper, Banqiao was perfect, the shining proof of Mao's vision. The valley below began to flourish. Farmers planted rice in once-flooded fields. New villages appeared along the riverbanks, and the people trusted the dam completely. It became a backdrop of their lives, silent, dependable, and eternal. For more than 20 years it stood untouched, holding back the restless waters of the Ru. Generations grew up believing the wall would never fail. But in the summer of 1975, the skies above Henan began to change. Unseen currents gathered strength, forming the beginning of what would soon become one of the most destructive storms in recorded history. A storm that would test not only the dam's walls, but the very limits of human control. In early August 1975, Typhoon Nina approached China's southeastern coast with silent fury. What began as a tropical storm over the Pacific soon grew monstrous, its spiraling clouds feeding on warm ocean air. The storm battered Fujian province before moving inland, slowed but still immense. By the time it reached Henan, it wasn't just a storm, it was a force of nature rewriting the landscape. In the city of Zhumadian, where Banqiao Dam stood, people were used to rain. But this was different. The wind howled like a living creature, pulling at roofs and trees. Rain hammered the ground without pause, thick sheets of water turning roads into rivers within hours. For 3 days and nights, the sky did not rest. It was as if the heavens had opened and refused to close. The rainfall was beyond comprehension, over 1 meter of water in just 24 hours. The local weather stations could not keep up. Their instruments failed, their records drowned. Villagers watched the Ru River swell, creeping higher each hour, until the once distant roar of the dam became a part of the storm's voice. Inside the control rooms, operators stared at blinking gauges that climbed far beyond the red lines. Communication lines crackled and died. Roads vanished under torrents of mud. The engineers knew what the numbers meant, but help was impossible to reach. Orders were sent by radio, pleading to open the sluice gates, but the transmission faltered in the static. When the message finally arrived, it was too late. The lower gates were jammed by debris, and the upper ones could barely move. The dam had become a trap, water piling up behind it, pressure rising like a giant's breath. Panic spread quietly through the night. Some workers were told to stay, to monitor the situation, to do whatever they could. They did not know that they were witnessing the final hours of the Iron Dam. At around midnight on August 7th, lightning ripped the sky. Witnesses said the flash revealed the dam's surface trembling, shuddering under invisible weight. A roaring sound followed, deep and endless, like the earth itself breaking apart. The central section cracked. Within seconds, a hole opened, small at first, then expanding with terrifying speed. Billions of tons of water, held back for decades, surged through the breach. It was not a wave. It was a moving mountain, 30 feet high, racing down the valley at nearly 50 kilometers per hour. In the darkness, there was no warning, no siren. Villages below vanished before anyone could scream. Entire families disappeared, swept away in their sleep. And in that moment, the Banqiao Dam, symbol of pride and progress, became the source of one of humanity's greatest hidden tragedies. When the Banqiao Dam burst, the noise was described by survivors as something beyond thunder, a sound that didn't just echo but pressed against the chest, vibrating through the bones. In that instant, the calm night transformed into chaos. A wall of water carrying the force of an atomic blast swept across the valley, devouring everything in its path. The wave raced outward, tearing through smaller dams downstream like paper screens. Each rupture added more water, more destruction. Within hours, an entire network of 60 dams had collapsed, amplifying the disaster beyond imagination. The flood moved faster than any horse or car. It carried houses, trees, animals, and people alike, a wild torrent of life and ruin. Some villagers awoke to the sound of cracking wood, believing at first it was just wind. But when they opened their doors, they saw nothing but darkness and rising water. The current was so strong it ripped clothes from bodies, tore children from their parents' arms, and hurled entire buildings into the air. In towns like Dawencheng and Suiping, the wave arrived before dawn, silencing everything it touched. In the control stations, there was disbelief. Engineers who had trusted their calculations could only watch helplessly as their instruments went blank. Many stayed until the very end, recording data even as the flood reached their walls. Some never left their posts. They were later remembered only by fragments of reports, found buried in mud weeks later. By morning, the plains of Henan had turned into an inland sea, stretching more than 50 kilometers wide. Bridges vanished, railways buckled, power lines dangled into the brown water, sizzling and dying. Survivors clung to rooftops, trees, or floating debris, calling out names that were lost in the wind. The smell of mud and oil filled the air. Birds had fled, leaving only the sound of rushing water and distant cries. The Banqiao breach released roughly 700 million cubic meters of water in just 6 hours, enough to fill 500,000 Olympic pools. In some places, the water rose as high as 12 meters, submerging entire towns. Those who survived the first wave soon faced another terror. Silence. The storm had passed, the sky cleared, but the land beneath was gone. Roads had become rivers, and the rivers had no direction. The survivors were trapped on isolated islands of ruin, surrounded by endless water, waiting for help that would not come for days. Dawn revealed a landscape that no longer resembled the Henan province people once knew. The valley, once dotted with rice paddies and villages, had turned into a vast inland ocean. Trees poked from the surface like blackened fingers, roofs drifted miles from where homes had stood, and animals floated lifeless beside fragments of human life. A chair, a shoe, a child's toy. Those who had survived the first wave were stunned into silence. They had lost families, homes, and the very ground beneath their feet. No one could grasp the scale of what had just happened. When the water receded slightly, a brown world emerged, heavy mud coating everything, carrying the smell of decay and oil. Survivors stumbled through the sludge searching for loved ones, sometimes finding only clothing tangled in branches. In towns like Suping and Linquan, the flood had wiped out entire generations. Some villages that had existed for centuries simply disappeared from maps. People built temporary rafts from doors, barrels, anything that floated. Some drifted for days, with no sense of direction, guided only by the sun and the faint hope of rescue. But the nightmare did not end when the water stopped rising. The true horror began after. The flood had destroyed roads and communication lines, cutting off hundreds of thousands of people. Rescue teams couldn't reach them. Helicopters were few, fuel was scarce, and the scale of devastation made coordination nearly impossible. Many survivors were stranded on rooftops or small patches of land, surrounded by water that stretched to the horizon. They drank from the flood itself, unaware it was poisoned by decay and chemicals from broken storage depots. The summer heat returned quickly, turning the stagnant floodwaters into breeding grounds for disease. Mosquitoes swarmed over the bodies that lay beneath the surface. Dysentery, hepatitis, and cholera began to spread, claiming lives faster than the flood itself. With roads gone, food couldn't reach the isolated survivors. People began to starve, their crops gone, their livestock drowned. In the village of Wangcheng, families boiled bark and grass, while others tried to eat anything that might keep them alive. Children cried through the night, their voices growing weaker with each day. Reports of the disaster barely travelled beyond the province. Local officials hesitated to send news to Beijing, fearing blame. The chain of command was broken. When the central government finally learned of the scale of the catastrophe, it was already too late for thousands. Official rescue orders were delayed, and some teams sent to help were themselves cut off by the remaining floodwaters. For 9 long days, vast areas remained completely isolated. No communication, no supplies, no sound but the lapping of brown waves against shattered walls. And through it all, the survivors waited, not knowing that the world beyond their drowned villages had yet to even hear their cries. In the days that followed, the survivors of Banqiao's collapse entered a realm between life and death. Entire counties became islands, disconnected from the rest of the nation. The sun rose each morning over a silent sea, glinting on rooftops that once sheltered families. The floodwater shimmered deceptively calm, hiding beneath it a graveyard of villages and people. Those who had found higher ground tried to organize what remained of their communities. Farmers, soldiers, and teachers worked side by side, building makeshift rafts, sharing the last bits of grain, and burying the dead when they could. The stench was unbearable. In some places, corpses covered the surface of the water, bloated by heat and decay. People burned straw in piles to drive away the smell, though it did little. Many chose to remain silent, their minds refusing to accept the scale of loss. Mothers waited on rooftops, scanning the horizon for boats that never came. In Jumadian, where the dam once stood proud, there was nothing but ruins, broken concrete slabs jutting out like the ribs of a fallen beast. Engineers who survived the breach stood at the site in disbelief. Some wept openly, others simply stared, knowing the dream they had built their lives around had turned into a monument of sorrow. On the 4th day, military units began to arrive. Exhausted soldiers in small boats navigating through debris and the bodies of livestock. They came without clear orders, only told to assist the people. But where to begin? The area of destruction stretched over thousands of square kilometres. They rescued whoever they could reach first, children clinging to trees, old men waving shirts from rooftops, families crowded on patches of dirt barely above water. Some were pulled aboard so weak they could not speak. Helicopters appeared next, dropping food and supplies when the weather allowed. Bags of rice burst upon impact, scattering like sand. In many places, survivors fought over the drops. not out of greed but desperation. Some drowned trying to swim toward the falling packages. The pilots could do little but circle and watch. They saw scenes of unimaginable loss, vast fields of floating debris, towns turned to mud, roads erased. For them, the flood zone seemed endless. By the end of the first week, the water began to recede slowly, leaving behind thick layers of sludge. Houses that had been submerged emerged half destroyed, filled with silt and silence. Survivors wandered through the ruins, calling out names. Dogs, wild with hunger, roamed the wreckage. What had once been a thriving agricultural plain was now a wasteland. Yet amid the horror, there were moments of humanity. A soldier carrying a child on his back for miles, a woman sharing the last of her water with an injured stranger, a small group lighting a candle on a roof as night fell, whispering prayers for those lost. The Banqiao flood had erased an entire world, but in its ruins the smallest acts of compassion became the only light that remained. When the flood waters finally began to withdraw, the land revealed its scars like a body after battle. Mud covered everything, several feet thick in some areas, swallowing doors, windows and roads. Survivors walked barefoot through it, their legs sinking deep into the sticky brown mire. What had been a thriving province just weeks earlier was now unrecognisable, a wasteland of collapsed homes and silent fields. The once glittering rice paddies were gone, replaced by endless stretches of brown water reflecting a grey, indifferent sky. Farmers, who had spent decades cultivating this land, looked out over their fields and wept. As government rescue teams expanded their reach, they began to grasp the scale of destruction. Tens of thousands were missing. In some towns, nearly everyone was gone. The soldiers who arrived to clear debris were unprepared for what they found. The air was thick with rot. Entire families were found huddled together in the corners of what used to be their homes. In places like Suping County, rescuers had to burn bodies to prevent disease from spreading. Wooden pyres dotted the horizon, smoke rising slowly into the heavy air. Each column marked a story that would never be told. Local officials were overwhelmed. They had no supplies, no communication, and no experience managing a catastrophe of this size. Some villages went weeks without outside contact. When aid finally arrived, it was often too late. Helicopters dropped medical kits and rice, but there weren't enough doctors, and the few who came were already exhausted from days without rest. The survivors who made it to relief camps faced new dangers: hunger, fever, and despair. Many were too weak to move, lying on mats under the open sky as soldiers sprayed insecticide over stagnant puddles. Yet even amid this suffering, people began to rebuild fragments of normal life. Women washed clothes in muddy water, men repaired broken fishing nets, and children gathered pieces of wood to make fires. Some survivors carved small memorial tablets from stone, inscribing the names of family members lost to the flood. Priests and elders held quiet ceremonies, setting candles afloat down what remained of the Ru River. They believed that if the spirits were guided by light, they might find peace. In the cities beyond Henan, most people had no idea what had happened. State media briefly mentioned heavy rain and localized flooding, but nothing more. The world outside remained unaware that one of the worst dam disasters in human history had just occurred. Officials in Beijing were cautious, fearing the event would be seen as a failure of the nation's engineering pride. Reports were classified, photographs sealed. Survivors were told not to speak of what they had seen, and so, while the people of Henan mourned in silence, the rest of China continued on, unaware that an entire region had been washed from the map in a single night. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of what had happened began to settle upon those who remained. The survivors were haunted by two realities, the one they could see before them and the one they could not escape in their minds. The land was quiet now, too quiet, the kind of silence that feels alive. Every gust of wind over the dried mud carried the memory of screams and thunder. People spoke in whispers, as if the flood might return if they said its name too loudly. Many had lost entire families and now lived with strangers who had also lost everything. Communities were rebuilt not by choice, but by shared grief. Relief efforts slowly organised into something resembling order. Military engineers worked day and night to repair the main roads and rail lines so aid could finally reach the interior. Trains loaded with food and medicine rolled in from distant provinces, their arrival greeted with tears and exhaustion. The central government sent teams to assess the damage, but what they found was almost beyond comprehension. Crops had been erased across thousands of square kilometres, wells were polluted, livestock dead, and villages reduced to piles of clay and wood. It was not merely a flood, it was the collapse of an entire ecosystem. In many places the survivors lived in tents fashioned from tarps and bamboo poles. They slept on damp ground, swatting mosquitoes, listening to the strange stillness of nights that once echoed with crickets and laughter. Waterborne diseases continued to spread, and doctors did what they could with what little medicine they had. Soldiers dug shallow wells, purified water with chlorine, and distributed boiled rice, but the needs were endless. Some areas remained unreachable. Boats that tried to reach them returned damaged or never came back at all. Still, small signs of life began to return. Children, their bellies hollow from hunger, chased each other near puddles, their laughter fragile but real. Farmers gathered seeds from what little they had salvaged, hoping to plant again before autumn. Old men rebuilt shrines to the river gods, offering incense in trembling hands. There was an unspoken understanding among them. They would endure, even if no one beyond their borders ever knew. Meanwhile, the government began its quiet investigation. Teams of hydrologists and military officers visited the ruins of Banqiao. They measured, photographed, and took samples in silence. The conclusions were uncomfortable. The dam had not failed because of sabotage or enemy action, but because it was never designed to face what nature delivered that night. Typhoon Nina had brought nearly a year's worth of rain in just 3 days, far more than the 1,000-year flood standard on which Banqiao was built. The clay core had absorbed too much water, weakening from within, while the spillways clogged with debris. Every factor that could go wrong had aligned perfectly. It was, in every sense, a human tragedy shaped by human pride. The government's internal reports painted a grim picture, though they would never reach the public. The investigation revealed that warnings about Banqiao's safety had been ignored for years. Engineers who had expressed concern about maintenance and overflow capacity had been dismissed or silenced. During the years of rapid construction, politics had outweighed caution. Targets and timelines were sacred, and the appearance of success mattered more than the slow, invisible work of safety checks. The official conclusion avoided blame, describing the collapse as an extraordinary natural event. But those who read between the lines knew it was not nature alone that had failed that night. Survivors were forbidden to speak openly about what they had endured. Local officials, fearing punishment, downplayed the number of deaths in reports sent to Beijing. Villages that had lost thousands were recorded as having lost hundreds. Records were rewritten, maps redrawn, and documents quietly archived under restricted access. The flood had erased the land, and the government's silence would erase its memory. For the people of Henan, this was the second wave, one made of silence and denial. Life went on, though it bore little resemblance to what had come before. Families began rebuilding their homes from the mud bricks of the ruins. They planted corn and sorghum on the silt-covered fields, unsure if anything would grow. The land was heavy with toxins and dead matter, yet it was all they had. In many villages, small schools reopened in tents. Children sat on crates or stones, their teachers writing lessons on boards salvaged from destroyed buildings. Lessons in reading and math were taught beside lessons in survival. How to boil water, how to dig drainage ditches, how to tell if a structure might collapse. The flood had changed not only the land, but the rhythm of life itself. Despite the suffering, there was a quiet resilience among the people. In evenings, when the sky turned violet over the plains, villagers gathered by lantern light to share stories, not of the disaster, but of the times before it. They spoke of festivals, harvest dances, and the scent of summer rain before the dam had ever existed. Storytelling became a form of healing, a bridge between what was lost and what remained. Elders believed that if they remembered enough of the past, their descendants would carry it forward, even if the world tried to forget. In Beijing, discussions about the disaster continued behind closed doors. Some officials urged for greater transparency, arguing that future safety depended on learning from failure. Others insisted on secrecy to preserve stability and confidence in the state's modernization drive. In the end, secrecy won. The Banqiao tragedy became a classified subject, buried in internal archives. For decades, it would be referred to only as a major meteorological incident, a phrase that concealed the suffering of hundreds of thousands of people. But memory has a way of surviving, even when buried deep. And in the flooded valleys of Henan, people continue to remember, whispering the name Banqiao like a prayer that could not be spoken aloud. By the autumn of 1975, the survivors of Banqiao had endured more than nature's fury. They had endured silence. The fields were cracked now, the floodwaters long gone, replaced by dust that coated everything in a dull grey. The once fertile land lay poisoned and bare, its harvest gone for years to come. In some villages, survivors built huts from the bones of their homes, using roof tiles and broken beams as walls. Life returned slowly, not through hope but necessity. There were mouths to feed, graves to tend, and ruins to clear. The landscape looked frozen between two worlds, one where life had been vibrant, and one where it now lingered like an echo. The government's aid arrived gradually, wrapped in slogans of resilience. Posters appeared in town squares urging people to rebuild with courage and faith. State-run newspapers spoke of heroism and recovery, but never mentioned the word collapse. Official photographers took pictures of smiling villages receiving grain, carefully avoiding the endless stretches of devastation just beyond the frame. To outsiders, the story was one of triumph over disaster. To those living there, it felt like an erasure, as if their pain had been tidied away for history's sake. The military engineers tasked with reconstruction worked tirelessly. They repaired bridges, dredged rivers, and rebuilt sections of the railway that had been torn apart by the flood. But their task was enormous. In some places, entire towns had to be relocated to higher ground. Survivors who refused to move were often left isolated, clinging to land that no longer supported crops. The rebuilding was both physical and psychological, a test of will against the weight of memory. Each new brick laid over the mud felt like an attempt to bury the past along with the dead. The people adapted in small, quiet ways. Fishermen learned to cast their nets in new channels formed by the flood, where strange fish now swam in the altered rivers. Farmers discovered that watermelons and lotus grew better than rice in the new soil, and they turned destruction into livelihood. Children born after the flood played among the remnants of old bridges and broken dams, unaware of what lay beneath their feet. To them, Banqiao was not a tragedy but a landscape, a place their parents spoke of only in fragments. For those who remembered, the flood became a shadow in every decision. Some feared the sound of rain, refusing to sleep during storms. Others avoided rivers altogether, as if the water itself carried memories of vengeance. In the evenings, families would light candles on the water, watching them drift down the river that had both sustained and destroyed them. These acts were never called mourning, only remembrance. No one dared to build large memorials. Instead, memory lived in gestures, a mother tracing names in the dirt, an old man rebuilding the same small bridge each year, though no one crossed it anymore. The Banqiao Dam was gone, but its spirit lingered in every raindrop, every field, and every silence that followed a thunderclap. Years passed, and the story of Banqiao faded into whispers, carried only within families. Children who had survived the flood grew into adults, and many chose never to speak of it again. They married, rebuilt, and raised their own children, but each carried an invisible scar, a fear of storms, of the sound of rushing water, of sudden silence. When it rained heavily, they stayed awake, counting the seconds between thunder and lightning, remembering how quickly calm could become catastrophe. They didn't call it trauma, they called it caution. By the early 1980s, Henan had changed again. The region was rebuilding, new dams rising where the old ones had fallen. The government, determined to prevent another tragedy, ordered stricter construction standards, stronger floodgates, and better communication lines. Yet the story of Banqiao itself remained forbidden. The archives were sealed under state secrets, and survivors were discouraged from discussing the event even with outsiders. For them, remembering became an act of quiet defiance. They told their children fragments, never the full story, but enough to carry the weight of memory forward. Occasionally outsiders would visit Henan, engineers, journalists, or foreign specialists interested in flood control. They would see the repaired dams, the rebuilt towns, the new villages with freshly painted walls, and they would praise the progress. Few were told that beneath some of these lakes lay entire drowned towns. No one pointed out the mounds that served as mass graves. It was easier to speak of success than to reopen old wounds. Even local officials who knew the truth rarely spoke it aloud. To acknowledge the scale of the disaster was to question an entire era of belief, the idea that human will could conquer nature. In private, some engineers who had worked on Banqiao never recovered from guilt. They had followed orders, built to specification, and done everything the system demanded. Yet they could not forget the faces of those who had trusted them. A few retired early, choosing to live near temples or rivers, spending their final years in quiet repentance. One survivor, an engineer named Chen Xing, had been among the few who had once warned about the dam's weaknesses. After the disaster, his name disappeared from official records, but locals remembered him as the man who tried to speak truth when no one wanted to listen. His notebooks, filled with calculations and warnings, were passed among younger engineers as silent proof that not all disasters come from ignorance. Some come from pride. Time continued its slow erasure. Trees grew over the ruins, crops returned, and the river eventually carved new paths through the silt. But every few years, when rain poured for days without stopping, villagers would gather on the hills watching the water rise. They didn't need to be told what had once happened here. It lived in the soil, in the way their elders' eyes turned distant at the sound of thunder, and in the silence that always followed the rain. By the late 1980s, China had entered a new age of reform, its focus shifting toward modernization and economic growth. Factories rose where farmlands once stretched, and the scars of the Banqiao flood slowly disappeared beneath concrete and steel. The new generation knew little about what had happened. In schools, the story was not mentioned. Geography books spoke of rivers and irrigation projects, but not of collapse. For those who had survived, the silence was both mercy and burden. To speak meant risking trouble, to forget meant betraying memory, and so they kept the story within families, passed not through documents, but through quiet conversation at dinner tables, through the tremble in an old woman's voice when thunder rolled in the distance. Every few years, rumours would surface, travellers mentioning an ancient flood, an engineer whispering about a forbidden report, a local historian trying to piece together the truth. But official archives remained sealed. Researchers who tried to publish findings on the Banqiao collapse found their work rejected or delayed. Some lost their positions entirely. The tragedy had become a ghost, invisible in the daylight, but impossible to erase at night. In small museums across Henan, artifacts from the 1970s displayed the era's achievements, yet there were no photographs of the flood, no mention of the dam's name. Meanwhile, those who lived through it began to age. Their memories softened around the edges but never faded completely. Some survivors gathered every August to light incense by the river, pretending it was for ancestors, though both they and the river knew who the prayers were truly for. A handful of villages built small hidden shrines near the hills, marked by simple stones with no names. In one such place, an old woman visited daily, placing wildflowers she gathered herself. When asked why she came so often, she only smiled and said, "I promised someone I would remember." The river itself had changed too. Its course shifted slightly after the flood, carving new bends where the old ones had been flattened. Fishermen said the water was quieter there, deeper, as if carrying a secret. Some swore they still heard sounds on still nights, faint cries carried in the wind, the echoes of what the water once consumed. Most dismissed it as imagination, but even the skeptics would look away when lightning lit the valley. The government eventually reopened limited discussions about dam safety, though the Banqiao collapse was never directly mentioned. New training manuals for engineers included anonymous case studies of structural failure during extreme weather. The lessons were clear but impersonal, stripped of human faces and pain. Yet for those who read them carefully, the story beneath was unmistakable. Quietly, China's new generation of hydrologists learned the unspoken rule of their profession, that the greatest danger to a dam is not the storm, but the arrogance that believes it cannot come. In the villages that rose over the ruins, life continued with the rhythm of the seasons. Children played by the riverbanks, farmers bent over seedlings, and thunderclouds rolled in the distance as they always had. But somewhere deep beneath the soil, beneath the layers of silt and silence, the memory of Banqiao waited, not forgotten, only sleeping. When the 1990s arrived, China's pace of change quickened beyond anything the survivors of Banqiao could have imagined. Cities expanded, highways cut through the countryside, and the hum of machinery replaced the quiet of rice fields. The new world demanded progress, not reflection. And so, the flood, the great unspoken wound of Henan, was left further behind, hidden under layers of new roads, apartment blocks, and collective forgetfulness. Only those who had seen the wave with their own eyes still felt its presence, like a weight pressing down in humid air before a storm. Some of them began to write. Elderly teachers, retired engineers, and farmers with little schooling recorded their memories in notebooks, hoping their stories would survive even if they could not. They wrote not for fame, but for truth, knowing the truth might never be published. Their handwriting trembled, and their words were simple, but they captured the humanity that official records erased. "I remember the sound," one man wrote. "It was not thunder, not wind, not war. It was the earth crying." These hidden diaries circulated quietly, copied by hand, passed to students or journalists who visited from other provinces. They were fragile threads of remembrance woven through decades of silence. In 1993, a young journalist from Beijing accidentally uncovered one of these stories while researching rural poverty. He visited Suping County and spoke with old villagers who told him of the Great Water. The more he asked, the more doors closed. Local officials warned him not to dig further, but curiosity has its own current, impossible to dam. He found unofficial reports written by army rescue units and photos smuggled out by soldiers who had witnessed the devastation. What he discovered shook him. Thousands of villages gone, hundreds of thousands dead, and the government's official toll listed as only a fraction of the truth. His attempt to publish was stopped before it reached print, but words spread quietly through academic circles. The silence cracked, even if only by a hairline fracture. Meanwhile, Banqiao itself had changed again. The new dam, smaller and stronger, stood on the same site as its predecessor, built not as a symbol but as a necessity. Locals visited rarely, preferring to avoid the place altogether. Grass had overgrown the old embankment, where only fragments of concrete remained visible. Birds nested in the cracks. Sometimes travellers passing through the valley could not even tell that the land beneath them had once drowned an entire civilization. Nature had done what it always does, covered tragedy with beauty. The air was clear, the river gentle, the hills peaceful, but the stillness was deceptive. To those who knew, it was not calm but silence, the kind that holds its breath, waiting for someone brave enough to speak again. And though the government still denied it, The truth of Banqiao was beginning to move quietly, like underground water seeping toward the surface. History, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way back to the light. By the turn of the millennium, whispers of Banqiao began to drift beyond Henan's borders. The world was changing. Information could now travel faster, freer, and farther than ever before. The internet had arrived in China, and with it came the smallest cracks in decades of silence. At first, the flood appeared only as a rumour on message boards. A dam collapse in the 1970s, some wrote, so big the maps had to be redrawn. Others dismissed it as folklore, another ghost story from the countryside. But among those fragments, truth began to form shape. Former soldiers, now old men, shared what they remembered. How the rescue helicopters could not land, how the bodies drifted for days, how their orders had been to collect names, but most of the names were gone. In 2003, a short article appeared in a regional newspaper referencing a large-scale hydrological incident in Jumadian in 1975. It mentioned no death toll, no dam name, yet for those who knew, the message was unmistakable. Within days, the issue vanished from stands, replaced by new editions, but the article had already been scanned and shared online, copied across forums before it could be erased. For the first time, Banqiao's silence began to echo. Historians outside China started to ask questions, digging into foreign archives for weather records, military reports, and old satellite images. Slowly, a buried tragedy resurfaced through data and memory. Survivors who had lived their entire lives under the weight of secrecy began to speak more openly. They were elderly now, with little left to fear. Some appeared in small local interviews, their faces lined but their voices steady. They described the night the sky split open, the roar of the water, the weeks that followed. One man, now in his 70s, said, "We built our lives again, but every night I still hear it. That sound when the dam broke. It never stopped." His testimony spread through online forums like a heartbeat in static. For younger generations, the idea that their country had hidden such a colossal disaster was almost unthinkable. Many dismissed it as Western exaggeration. Yet, as more documents surfaced, the weight of evidence grew undeniable. International researchers began estimating the scale. Over 170,000 people dead, 11 million displaced, and countless more affected by famine and disease in the aftermath. These numbers, shocking in magnitude, barely hinted at the human reality beneath them. In Henan, locals started visiting the old dam site again. They found no memorials, no plaques, just wild grass and the faint hum of the rebuilt power station nearby. Some brought incense or paper offerings, burning them quietly before leaving. Others came simply to stand in silence. To the younger ones, it felt surreal, how something so vast, so catastrophic, could vanish from history so completely. But history does not vanish. It waits. It hides in diaries, in whispers, in the quiet persistence of those who remember. And now, nearly 30 years after the flood, Banqiao's story was finally beginning to return, not as accusation, but as truth long overdue. As the 2000s unfolded, Banqiao's truth began to surface in fragments, slow, uneven, but unstoppable. Academics quietly exchanged scanned pages from long-suppressed reports, many marked top secret. Some came from retired officials who could no longer bear the weight of silence. Others were rediscovered by accident, tucked away in forgotten filing cabinets, their paper edges yellowed with time. Each page was a window into the night of August 7th, 1975. Rainfall charts, telegrams pleading for gate releases, lists of missing villages. For those who studied them, the data spoke louder than any confession. It was not just a flood. It was the moment when belief in total control met the truth of chaos. In 2005, a Chinese hydrologist named Wang Zemin published a cautiously worded essay in an internal engineering journal. Without naming Banqiao, he described a critical lesson from the failure of overconfidence. His words were diplomatic, Yet between the lines lay an unmistakable reference. Among professionals, the meaning was clear. The article circulated quietly, eventually reaching online readers who recognized its hidden subject. Soon, foreign outlets began to connect the dots. Western journalists using old weather data and declassified US satellite images reconstructed the path of the flood, tracing its spread across the plains of Henan. They published reports that reached millions. Stories of forgotten villages, unmarked graves, and the storm that China had tried to erase. Inside the country, official reaction was cautious. Some state outlets acknowledged severe flooding in 1975, calling it a national tragedy caused by extreme weather. Yet the numbers remained understated, and the word collapse was still avoided. Still, even that partial admission felt historic. For survivors, it was as if the world had finally heard a sound that had been echoing only inside their memories. People who had never met began finding each other online, sharing stories, names, and photographs. Children who had grown up without grandparents learned for the first time where and how their families had been lost. Memorial efforts emerged quietly, grassroots and fragile. A group of young volunteers from Zhengzhou travelled to the old Banqiao site, bringing flowers and small stones engraved with dates. They placed them along the riverbank, whispering the names of towns that no longer existed. Local authorities didn't interfere, but they didn't endorse it either. The remembrance remained unofficial, carried out by ordinary people who believed memory itself was a form of justice. In time, more visitors came. Some brought cameras, others simply bowed and left. Even as the story gained light, it remained half-shadowed. The Banqiao tragedy was still not taught in schools, still absent from museums, still treated as a whisper rather than a wound. But the silence had cracked, and cracks, once formed, never truly close. Beneath the hum of China's modern cities, beneath the traffic and neon lights, the ghosts of 1975 were stirring, not to haunt, but to be seen. And every summer when storms rolled over Henan, rain hitting the roofs like the rhythm of memory, the land seemed to remember too. By 2010, the Banqiao tragedy had begun to find its way into conversations once thought impossible. The rise of social media allowed personal stories to flow beyond the control of editors or officials. Posts appeared under the cover of history discussions, where users shared grainy photos of the dam ruins, old rescue maps, or fragments of memoirs. Some of these posts vanished within hours, quietly deleted, but others spread too quickly to stop. A digital generation, one that had grown up hearing only of China's triumphs, suddenly found itself staring at one of its buried sorrows. Young people messaged survivors, asking simple questions. Where were you that night? What happened to your village? And for the first time, many of the old voices answered. Those who remembered did not speak with anger, but with the kind of calm that comes from decades of silence. They described how the rain had fallen without pause, how people had prayed for the gates to open, how families had climbed trees and rooftops only to watch the waves rise higher. Their words were plain and unsentimental, yet devastating in their honesty. One woman wrote, "I lost everything but my heartbeat." That sentence was reposted thousands of times, quoted in poems and essays as a quiet anthem of survival. Gradually, amateur historians began piecing together the full chain of events. They used public rainfall records, engineering blueprints, and weather satellite archives that had been declassified abroad. Step by step, they mapped the truth. The Banqiao Dam collapse triggered a cascade failure across more than 60 structures, releasing a flood that moved faster than sound could warn. The scale was unlike anything seen before in modern China. Hundreds of villages erased in hours. Yet the most haunting part wasn't the water itself, but the decades that followed, where silence drowned the truth. Foreign documentaries appeared on television and online, telling the story to global audiences. They showed animations of the storm, interviews with survivors, and satellite reconstructions of the floodplain. For many viewers in China, These documentaries were the first time they saw the tragedy in colour, even if accessed through unofficial channels. Watching them brought mixed emotions: grief, anger, disbelief, but also relief. Relief that the story was finally being told, even if by others. The Chinese government responded cautiously. Some officials allowed the publication of limited accounts, emphasising heroic rescue efforts and valuable lessons learned. The tone was careful, but the acknowledgement itself was monumental. In Henan, local authorities began maintaining the new Banqiao reservoir more transparently, opening it to public tours that framed the disaster as a technical lesson rather than a moral one. Tour guides spoke of engineering improvements and weather anomalies, but locals who stood on that ground knew the truth ran deeper, and still, every August, as the anniversary approached, villagers placed candles by the river. No monument marked the site, no speeches were made, yet the air grew heavy with remembrance. The flicker of those flames reflected in the water like silent stars, each one a soul that history had almost erased but never truly could. In the years that followed, Banqiao's memory slowly transformed from forbidden topic to quiet folklore. It no longer belonged only to historians or survivors. It became part of the cultural undercurrent that shaped how people viewed progress and fragility. Songs, poems, and novels began to reference a night when the river broke its promise. Even when names were omitted, those who knew could read between the lines. University students studying engineering debated the ethics of speed over safety, citing unnamed lessons from the past. Artists painted stormy skies and half-submerged villages, their work displayed in small exhibitions under titles like Water and Silence or August Rain. It was no longer about accusation, but understanding. Technology accelerated the rediscovery. High-resolution satellite imagery allowed scientists to digitally reconstruct the flood, modelling how each wave travelled through the plains. They found that the largest surge reached speeds of nearly 45 kilometres per hour, carrying everything in its path for more than 50 kilometres. Simulation showed how smaller dams downstream amplified the devastation, creating a chain reaction that magnified the destruction far beyond Banqiao itself. Seeing the data brought a strange clarity. The event was not just a failure of engineering, but of foresight, of the illusion that humanity could permanently cage a living river. For survivors, this recognition was bittersweet. They had spent decades in silence, and now, as the world finally began to acknowledge their pain, many were nearing the end of their lives. Interviews recorded in the early 2010s captured their voices calm and measured. One man, now in his 80s, said, "I used to think we would all be forgotten, but now maybe we can rest." His words appeared in a small documentary that circulated online before being quietly removed, though copies lived on through shared drives and archives abroad. The flood that had once erased memory now birthed a new kind of resistance, one made of remembrance. The government gradually shifted its tone. In academic forums and local museums, the disaster began to be mentioned more openly, though always framed within scientific terms. Extreme meteorological event, infrastructure lessons, humanitarian response. The emotional reality remained unspoken, but at least it was no longer entirely denied. In Jamadian, a modest plaque appeared near the rebuilt dam, describing the 1975 event as a major flood affecting the region. No names, no numbers, but for locals, it was enough to stand in front of something that at last admitted what had happened. Each year, the region continued to grow. Roads widened, factories hummed, and modern apartment towers rose along the same riverbanks that once drowned in darkness. Yet when heavy rain fell and the sirens wailed their routine warnings, the older residents still looked toward the horizon with unease. They had seen what water could do when pride and weather conspired. They had learned, in the hardest way, that progress means nothing if memory is lost. And so, in the hush between thunderclaps, the people of Henan still listened, not for fear, but for remembrance. By the mid-2010s, Banqiao had become a symbol that lived between truth and myth. On the surface, it was an engineering case study, an event cited in hydrology journals, discussed cautiously in universities, and mentioned briefly in documentaries about dam safety. But beneath those polished layers, it remained something deeper. A quiet collective memory shared by millions, even among those who hadn't been born when it happened. For younger Chinese who discovered the story online, Banqiao was not only about water and concrete, it was about humanity, about how easily stories can be washed away and how hard they must fight to return. Internet archives became the new memory keepers. Blogs and micro-documentaries shared satellite reconstructions of the floodplain, interviews with survivors, and maps comparing the pre- and post-disaster landscapes. Some of these digital records were taken down, yet they always reappeared elsewhere, mirrored and preserved by anonymous hands. It was as though the internet itself had become the river, sometimes blocked, sometimes diverted, but never truly stopped. Each repost, each shared image, carried the story a little farther, beyond borders, beyond censorship, into permanence. Among scholars, a quiet reckoning began. Hydrologists admitted that the Banqiao design, though advanced for its time, had been rushed under political pressure. The idea of the 1,000-year flood, once a mark of pride, was now seen as dangerously naive. New regulations were passed, requiring modern dams to withstand far greater extremes, with mandatory spillway redundancies and remote communication backups. Though no one said it outright, every new policy bore the invisible signature of Banqiao's lessons. In this way, the dead guided the living, their loss reshaping the very science meant to protect future generations. In Henan, the survivors' descendants carried forward remembrance through small personal rituals. Some kept glass jars of river water on home altars, others folded paper boats during the Ghost Festival, writing the names of ancestors lost to the flood before setting them afloat. These gestures were private, yet they rippled across time. Grandchildren listened to their grandparents' fragmented memories and felt a strange pull toward the unseen, the understanding that behind every act of silence lies a sea of stories untold. As China continued to modernize, the landscape around Banqiao grew unrecognizable. Highways cut through what had once been marshes, and new reservoirs gleamed beneath the sun. Yet even amid this progress, the ground carried traces of its past. Excavations occasionally uncovered remnants of old villages, porcelain bowls, roof tiles, tools, washed into sediment in 1975 and brought back to light by construction crews. Local workers would pause, brush off the dirt, and stand quietly for a moment before continuing. None of them needed to be told what those objects meant. The flood might have vanished from official calendars, but it remained written in the soil itself, and somewhere deep within that same earth, beneath the concrete of the rebuilt dam, the river still whispered softly against the stone, as if remembering too, patient, ancient, and waiting for the world to keep listening. As the story of Banqiao spread through the digital age, it began to intertwine with something larger, the human need to confront the cost of progress. To many, the dam's collapse was no longer only a historical tragedy. It was a mirror held up to modern ambition. Cities continued to expand, new dams continued to rise, and yet the lessons of Banqiao remained etched into every blueprint, a silent warning that nature's patience is finite. Environmentalists began to cite the flood when arguing for balance between development and ecology, calling it a caution carved in water. University debates, once sterile and technical, now touched on morality, accountability, and the weight of truth withheld. In Henan, however, life moved quietly. The valley that had once drowned was now green again, the rice fields lush, the rivers clear, the hills peaceful. Time had softened the scars but not erased them. Farmers still told their children never to underestimate the river, speaking of it as if it were alive, capable of both mercy and wrath. On humid summer nights, when thunder rolled over the plain, the old ones would look toward the horizon with eyes that had seen the unthinkable. Some still believed that the souls lost in 1975 lingered in the rain, protecting the living from another flood. For them, every storm was both a warning and a reunion. In 2015, a team of independent researchers published a comprehensive study of the Banqiao event using satellite data, hydrological modelling, and survivor testimony. For the first time, the numbers were openly discussed. Over 170,000 lives lost, millions displaced, and more than 60 dams destroyed in the chain reaction. The report spread online before officials could contain it. It sparked renewed interest around the world. Headlines, documentaries, academic conferences. Western media called it the disaster China forgot, though the phrase felt unfair to those who had never forgotten, only been forbidden to speak. Inside China, the report circulated quietly among students, scholars, and families who finally had words for what their elders had endured. That same year, an elderly man named Liu Ming, one of the last surviving engineers from the Banqiao project, gave a rare interview. His voice trembled, but his eyes remained steady. "We believed we were building something eternal," he said. "We didn't understand that eternity is not made of stone, but of truth. When truth breaks, everything else follows." His words resonated across social platforms shared thousands of times before being taken down. Yet even in deletion, they persisted, quoted in screenshots, saved in foreign archives, immortalized in memory. As the 40th anniversary passed, quiet memorials appeared once again along the river. No officials attended, no cameras were allowed, but candles flickered on the water all the same. Locals said the air felt heavier that evening, as if the river itself had paused to listen. In that silence there was no anger, only remembrance, a shared understanding that what happened in 1975 was not merely a disaster of the past, but a reminder that every generation stands at the same edge between pride and humility. And as the rain began to fall softly once more, the people of Henan did what they had always done. They waited, they endured, and they remembered. By the late 2010s, the Banqiao tragedy had become a subject spoken of in two worlds. One official, where it was treated as a historical meteorological event, and one human, where it was remembered as an open wound. The contradiction reflected the duality of modern China itself, forward-looking, technologically ambitious, yet carrying unspoken grief beneath its foundations. In classrooms, teachers occasionally mention the 1975 flood as a lesson in hydrology, avoiding the names of the dead. Meanwhile, online forums shared personal recollections, letters, and songs dedicated to those who were lost. The two narratives existed side by side, never touching, yet both true in their own ways. A new generation of filmmakers and writers began exploring the story through fiction. Since direct reference was risky, they disguised it beneath allegory. Films about rivers rebelling against their dams or villages swallowed by endless rain. Audiences recognized the symbols instantly. Festivals abroad praised these works for their emotional depth, unaware that behind each metaphor lay a real event buried in mud and silence. Among Chinese viewers, such art became a code of remembrance. They could not say Banqiao, but they could feel it, see it, and carry it forward through imagination. Environmental scientists too returned to the subject, not through politics but through data. Using decades of rainfall and climate records, they concluded that the storm of 1975 had been amplified by rare meteorological convergence, a stalled typhoon feeding on warm air currents trapped by surrounding mountains. It was, by every metric, extraordinary. Yet they also agreed on another truth. Even the greatest storm could have been survived if human pride had not stood in the way. The lesson echoed through policy papers and conferences, shaping disaster management strategies for the new century. The flood had finally become what it should have always been, a teacher. For the people of Henan, remembrance was quieter but deeper. In the rebuilt towns, life thrived again. Children played by the riverbanks. Farmers harvested in the same fields that once lay under 10 meters of water, and markets buzzed with life. But the flood lived on in the small details. The way villagers kept extra food during summer, the the way they built their homes a little higher, the way they grew silent whenever the sky darkened. They didn't need memorials to remember. The land itself had memory. One evening in 2018, an old woman named Zhang Yue stood by the river with her granddaughter. The girl asked why she always brought flowers there when no one was buried nearby. Zhang smiled faintly and said, "Because this is where we learned that water remembers us, even when the world forgets." Her words captured the essence of Banqiao, not tragedy, but endurance. Stories like hers continue to surface, simple yet profound, each one a ripple extending across time. That same year, researchers confirmed through aerial imaging that remnants of dozens of drowned villages still lay intact beneath the sediment, ghost outlines of streets, courtyards, and temples sealed under layers of history. Scientists called it archaeology. The locals called it something else, the earth remembering what humans tried to hide. And as the river wound quietly through the valley once more, it carried both silence and truth, flowing onward, as it always had, toward the sea. As the new decade dawned, the story of Banqiao existed in a strange state, not quite remembered, not quite forgotten. It had survived censorship, neglect, and time itself, carried forward by people who refused to let silence be the final word. For them, it was no longer only about the flood. It was about the courage to keep a story alive when the world preferred convenience over truth. In the quiet corners of online archives, the names of lost villages were being catalogued one by one, each added like a small act of resurrection. A generation that had never seen the flood now became its archivists, piecing together the fragments their elders had left behind. Across Henan, there were subtle signs that memory had begun to find its way home. Schools in rural towns started teaching short modules on local history, where teachers, speaking carefully, included the events of 1975 under broader lessons about resilience. They used euphemisms, the Great Rain, the night the water came, but the meaning was clear. Students would look at old photos of the region before and after the disaster and fall silent, sensing that something sacred lay beneath those images. To learn about Banqiao was to touch something fragile yet enduring, the part of humanity that survives even when everything else is washed away. Outside China, researchers continue to refine their understanding. By 2020, hydrologists used advanced simulation technology to recreate the dam's collapse in precise detail, showing how pressure built in layers before the structure gave way. The visualizations were both scientific and haunting. Watching them, one could almost feel the fear of that night, the vibration in the ground, the roar of the torrent, the sudden silence that followed. The reconstruction circulated widely online, finding audiences who had never heard of the tragedy. For the first time, Banqiao's story reached millions not through rumour or speculation, but through evidence and empathy combined. Meanwhile, in the villages near Jumadian, an unmarked annual ritual continued. Each August, as the anniversary approached, locals gathered by the river with lanterns and candles. They spoke little. The younger ones carried the lights, while the elders stood by the water's edge, watching their reflections drift downstream. In that glow, generations met, those who had lived through the flood and those who had only inherited its silence. The ritual was simple. No speeches, no prayers, only remembrance. The candles floated together, forming fragile constellations across the surface of the river. In those moments, the past and present blurred. The wind carried the faint scent of rain. The sound of frogs echoed from the reeds, and for an instant, it was as if the valley itself was breathing again. Some said the air felt heavier, others said it felt peaceful. Whatever it was, the people of Henan understood. The flood had taken their history but not their voice. And as the lights drifted toward the horizon, fading one by one into darkness, the river whispered the same promise it had kept for nearly half a century. Memory, like water, always finds its way back. In the years that followed, Banqiao's memory became a quiet current running beneath China's vast story of modernization. The country moved at breathtaking speed. New highways, new skyscrapers, new mega dams that dwarfed anything built before. Yet the people who lived along the rivers still looked at the water differently. They respected it, feared it, and above all remembered what it could take. The tragedy had become a hidden inheritance, shaping how ordinary families viewed progress. Every time the monsoon season came, old hands checked the skies, remembering a night when clouds didn't stop. Around 2021, environmental scholars began to use Banqiao as a framework for discussing climate resilience. The parallels were impossible to ignore. A world once again pushing the limits of nature, confident in its technology, sure of its control. Scientists revisited the archived storm data and realized that the rainfall from Typhoon Nina matched projections for modern superstorms driven by climate change. What had once been considered a one-in-a-thousand-year event was now, by global standards, becoming frighteningly common. The flood that had once belonged to the past was now a prophecy. Local writers in Henan took the story further. One novel, The River Forgets, told the tale of a young woman uncovering her grandmother's hidden diary from 1975. Though fiction, it read like confession. The book was published quietly, without fanfare, but spread by word of mouth and online recommendations. Readers across China were struck not by the scale of the disaster, but by its intimacy, how one night of water could ripple through generations. The novel's success marked a turning point. Banqiao had finally re-entered culture not as taboo, but as reflection. Meanwhile, the survivors who still lived near the new dam grew fewer each year. They had outlived the silence that once buried them. Some passed away in peace, others with their memories still sharp as the crack of thunder. Their children, now elders themselves, became the keepers of remembrance. They didn't hold ceremonies, they simply spoke, to grandchildren, to travellers, to anyone willing to listen. Their voices were steady, unblaming but clear. It wasn't the storm that broke the dam, one said. It was our belief that we could never fail. Across the ocean, Western historians began including Banqiao in global narratives of industrial disasters alongside Chernobyl and Bhopal. Documentaries re-aired every anniversary, featuring computer reconstructions and survivor interviews. In each retelling, the story grew a little more complete. The flood was no longer China's hidden shame, it was humanity's shared lesson. And still, amid that growing recognition, the people of Henan remained humble. They did not seek attention, only understanding. For them, remembrance was not about blame, but balance. The quiet acknowledgement that the river had always been both giver and taker, patient and merciless, ancient and eternal. By 2022, nearly half a century had passed since that night when the sky tore open and the earth gave way. The world had changed beyond recognition. Satellites watched every storm, algorithms predicted every rainfall, and yet the river in Henan still flowed with the same quiet indifference. It had seen civilizations rise and fall, and it would see many more. For the people who lived near Banqiao, progress was both comfort and reminder. They trusted the rebuilt dam, but only to a point. When lightning flashed in the distance, they still paused mid-sentence, as though listening for an echo from 1975. That year, a university in Zhengzhou launched a project called Echoes of Water, collecting oral histories from the few remaining survivors. Students with cameras and microphones visited the small villages around Zhemardian, recording stories from wrinkled faces and trembling voices. The project aimed not to reopen wounds, but to preserve them honestly before they were lost forever. Many of the elders spoke slowly, pausing between memories. They described the sound of rushing water, the smell of mud, the moment when the world turned to night. Some cried, others simply smiled sadly and said, "It was a long time ago." The recordings, once edited, were archived online under pseudonyms, quietly watched by millions before being removed. But copies circulated endlessly. Younger audiences reacted with awe and grief. For many, it was the first time they had heard their grandparents' generation speak without hesitation. The stories revealed not only suffering, but resilience. How people rebuilt with bare hands, shared their last grains of rice, and refused to let despair define them. Comment sections filled with messages of apology and admiration. "We never knew," wrote one user, "but we are listening now." The sentiment spread, and for a brief time Banqiao became a topic of unity rather than division. Meanwhile, international scholars refined their models, confirming that the Banqiao collapse remains the deadliest dam disaster in recorded history. Yet statistics could never convey what survivors already understood, that loss is measured not in numbers, but in silence. Each life taken by the flood had once held stories, laughter, dreams, and ordinary hopes, and in a way, every retelling of Banqiao became a resurrection of those unseen moments. In 2023, a filmmaker from Shanghai released a short independent film simply titled The Dam. It followed an elderly man returning to the site of the collapse after decades, speaking to the water as if to an old friend. "You've changed," he says in the film's closing line, "but then again, so have we." The film was poetic, restrained, and profoundly moving. Though it screened briefly before disappearing from platforms, its impact lingered, proof that art could reach where facts could not. That summer, heavy rains swept through Henan again. The new flood control systems held firm, but anxiety rippled quietly through the towns. At night, people still placed candles by their windows, a habit passed down through generations. They didn't call it mourning, only precaution. In truth, it was both. It was their way of saying to the river, "We remember, we understand, and we are still here." As the decades folded into the present, the Banqiao tragedy settled into the rhythm of history, not erased, but softened, like an old scar beneath the skin. For most of China, it had become a faint echo, a story whispered in documentaries and forgotten textbooks. Yet for the people of Henan, it remained personal. Their lives still followed the pulse of the river, their memories still shaped by the flood that had once erased the night. Each summer, when rain returned, so did a collective awareness. Not fear, but reverence. Water had once taken everything, but it had also given them something rare, the understanding that survival is both a duty and a gift. By 2024, Banqiao had found its place within a new global conversation. As floods and wildfires began reshaping the planet, journalists revisited old disasters to find lessons in them. Banqiao, once buried in silence, was now referenced in climate reports and policy discussions across the world. The story no longer belonged only to China. It had become a warning for everyone who thought they could master nature. In one widely shared article, a researcher wrote, "The tragedy of Banqiao is not that the dam failed, it's that human memory did." Those words struck a chord far beyond Henan. In the villages near Jumadian, memory had never failed. A new generation, raised with smartphones instead of shovels, began to digitize everything they could: photos, letters, hand-drawn maps of vanished towns. A small online archive appeared, created by descendants of survivors, quietly titled 1975, The Water We Remember. It contained scanned diaries, weather records, even songs written by farmers decades earlier. The project grew faster than expected, attracting volunteers who translated entries into multiple languages. For the first time, the world could hear Banqiao's story told not through institutions, but through the voices of those who lived it. Among the uploaded files was a short note found inside an old family Bible. The paper was yellow and almost unreadable, but one line remained clear: "If no one speaks, the river will." That sentence became the archive's motto. Users around the world shared it as a reminder that truth, like water, finds cracks to escape confinement. Through that simple phrase, the forgotten flood of 1975 became a living conversation about responsibility, empathy, and time. That year, survivors' descendants gathered for what might be the first public commemoration allowed near the dam. It wasn't official, but it wasn't forbidden either. They stood by the water as dusk fell, reading aloud names from handwritten lists. Some names were incomplete, others unknown. Yet the act itself mattered more than perfection. They were giving voice to the silenced, stitching history back together one name at a time. As lanterns floated out into the dark river, the wind carried the scent of rain and wet soil, the same smell that had marked the beginning of the tragedy 50 years before. In that moment, something shifted. For once, remembrance didn't feel like defiance. It felt like peace. The people of Henan were no longer speaking to the world, or even to the past. They were speaking to the river, thanking it, forgiving it, and asking it to remember them kindly in return. The 50th anniversary of the Banqiao collapse arrived quietly. There were no national broadcasts, no parades of remembrance. Only the steady rhythm of rain over Henan's fields, the same sound that had begun it all. For most of the country, it was an ordinary August day, but along the Ru River, hundreds of locals gathered at dawn, carrying white flowers, candles, and paper boats. They met near the water's edge, where the rebuilt dam loomed above like a silent monument. Some were descendants of survivors. Others had come simply to stand witness. No speeches were given, no officials in attendance, yet every face told the same story. We remember. The morning air was heavy with mist. When the first candle touched the water, ripples spread slowly, carrying the flame outward. One by one, hundreds more followed until the river shimmered with moving light. It wasn't just a memorial. It was a conversation with the past. Some whispered prayers. Others said nothing at all, because there were no words that could match the weight of memory. As the sun rose, the light on the water shifted from gold to white, and for a brief moment the surface seemed to glow, as if the river itself was answering back. Across the world, tributes appeared online. International news outlets published retrospectives, scientists revisited the data, and artists shared works inspired by the event. Hashtags like Banqiao 1975 and The Flood Remembered trended briefly, connecting people who had never met but felt the same quiet awe. Some posted family photos, others shared excerpts from the newly translated diaries. For the younger generation, it was their first encounter with a tragedy their textbooks never mentioned. Many expressed disbelief, not just at the scale of the disaster, but that it had been hidden for so long. In that sense, remembrance became revelation. Among the survivors, a few still alive spoke to reporters. Their voices were soft, their words deliberate. "We don't want pity," said one man, "only truth." Another woman, now in her 90s, added, "The flood took my parents, but it also gave me a lesson to never let silence win." These interviews were brief, but they resonated deeply. They reminded the world that history is not defined by monuments, but by the courage to remember without bitterness. As night fell over Henan, thunder rolled in the distance. People glanced upward but didn't run. The rain came lightly at first, then harder, drumming against umbrellas and lanterns. Yet no one left. They stood together, soaked and still, watching the candles drift away into darkness. It felt like both ending and beginning, the flood's shadow finally meeting its reflection in light. 50 years had passed, but the story had not drowned. It had endured, carried by those who refused to forget, proving once more that water destroys, but memory endures. In the months following the 50th anniversary, the ripples of remembrance continued to spread far beyond Henan. University students began hosting small forums, inviting historians and environmental scientists to discuss the Banqiao collapse, not as an isolated event, but as part of a wider dialogue about humanity's fragile relationship with nature. Documentaries once confined to foreign platforms were quietly shared in lecture halls. Professors used them to remind students that history's purpose is not blame, but awareness. "Every dam," one scholar said, is built of both earth and memory. Forget one, and the other will fail. Meanwhile, artists across China embrace the flood's legacy through new forms of expression. In Shanghai, a gallery opened an exhibition called The Weight of Water, featuring installations that use sound, light, and movement to recreate the feeling of being underwater. Visitors walk through dim rooms filled with the low hum of rushing water and distant thunder. It wasn't spectacle, it was meditation. One room displayed a single projection of a candle flickering endlessly, its flame bending but never extinguished. The plaque beneath it read, "For the ones who floated toward dawn." In Henan, the valley had become almost unrecognizable. Highways now crossed the same plains where waves once raced. The rebuilt dam powered nearby towns with hydroelectric energy, its walls strong, its sensors precise. Engineers gave guided tours, speaking of Banqiao with a tone somewhere between reverence and duty. "We don't build against the river anymore," one guide explained to visitors. "We build with it." For the locals, that phrase carried meaning beyond engineering. It was a philosophy born from pain, that true strength lies not in control but in understanding. Yet despite modernization, quiet rituals persisted. On summer nights, families still placed bowls of rice on windowsills to honor those lost. Children were told stories of the night of too much rain, learning early that nature listens but never negotiates. The rituals weren't superstition, they were continuity, small reminders that healing and remembering can coexist. Outside China, Banqiao had become part of a larger reckoning with forgotten disasters. Writers compared it to Chernobyl, to Fukushima, to every moment when faith in progress turned to humility. In academic circles, the flood was cited as proof that transparency saves lives more surely than concrete. It had taken 50 years, but the story that once drowned in secrecy had become a lighthouse for the world's engineers and leaders. Still, the people of Henan spoke of it differently. For them, Banqiao was not a symbol or a headline. It was a shared heartbeat, passed quietly through generations. When asked what the river meant now, one elderly woman said, "It forgave us." And perhaps that was true. The Ru River still flowed, calm, endless, unchanged, carrying with it the weight of history, the echoes of loss, and the quiet resilience of those who survived to remember. In 2026, a new generation of storytellers began reclaiming Banqiao in their own language, through podcasts, digital art, and virtual reconstructions. One project, titled The Night the Sky Fell, recreated the events of August 1975 using augmented reality. Users could walk through a digital version of Henan as it had been, before, during, and after the flood. It was haunting and beautiful, not for shock, but for empathy. People who had never known the story before found themselves standing in a quiet, virtual street, hearing the distant rumble of water approaching, then watching the world dissolve into silence. For many, it was the first time they truly felt the scale of what words alone could not convey. These new forms of remembrance spread fast. Independent filmmakers released short animations, combining survivor testimonies with watercolor imagery. Musicians composed symphonies inspired by rainfall and memory, turning the sound of water into melody. None of these works were officially endorsed, yet they travelled freely online, finding hearts across borders. The flood, once buried in secrecy, had become a source of connection, proof that even the deepest tragedy can be transformed into meaning when people choose to listen. In Henan itself, the landscape was thriving again. The plains had become fertile, dotted with wind turbines and green fields that shimmered under the sun. The new Banqiao reservoir supplied energy and irrigation to millions. Yet beneath that calm progress, locals still felt the invisible weight of history. "The water remembers," they said softly, half in superstition, half in faith. Each year, when the typhoon season began, officials tested the emergency sirens. Older residents always paused at the sound. They didn't panic anymore. They simply listened, measuring its tone, its rhythm, its promise of safety. The sirens no longer meant fear. They meant that someone, somewhere, had learned. Internationally, the story of Banqiao had entered environmental education. In universities across the world, students studied the event as part of climate ethics and engineering courses. It became a symbol of accountability, the reminder that progress built without humility eventually collapses. Documentaries streamed online drew millions of views. Viewers left comments filled with grief and awe. How did this stay hidden so long, they asked. But those from Henan answered simply, it wasn't hidden. We carried it. That same year, a small memorial stone appeared near the river, unannounced, unmarked by any government order. It bore no names, only one inscription. Here, the water spoke. No one claimed responsibility for placing it, yet every few weeks fresh flowers appeared beside it, and candles burned down to wax and ash. Perhaps it was placed by a survivor, or maybe by someone born long after the flood. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it stood, quietly, facing the water. The river flowed past it day after day, brushing against the shore as if in acknowledgement. And in that endless motion, the people of Henan found comfort. A silent conversation between memory and time, carried forever by the current. By the late 2020s, Banqiao had become more than a memory. It had become a mirror. Across the world, as climate disasters multiplied, people looked back to 1975 for answers written in water. Documentaries titled The Flood China Hid and The River That Spoke streamed globally, reaching millions who had never heard of the event. Viewers saw the footage of the dam's remains, the maps of drowned towns, and the faces of the few survivors still alive. But what struck them most wasn't the destruction. It was the calm with which those survivors spoke. They did not blame the storm, or even the government. They spoke of fragility, of the arrogance of certainty, of how easily silence can deepen tragedy. One woman, her voice trembling, said, "We built a wall to stop the river, but the wall grew in our hearts too." Her words became the film's final line, quoted worldwide. Within China, awareness continued to evolve quietly. Teachers in Henan began using Banqiao as a tool for emotional education, teaching empathy through history. Children were encouraged to interview their grandparents about the flood, to record their memories, to write reflections about water, courage, and grief. The initiative was unofficial but powerful. Through storytelling, the gap between generations began to close. For the first time, those who had lived through the tragedy felt truly heard by those who hadn't. Memory became dialogue, an inheritance of honesty. Scholars from Beijing University released a groundbreaking environmental ethics paper arguing that Banqiao represented the intersection of engineering, humanity, and humility. It was widely circulated and quoted in international journals. The paper concluded with a single quiet truth. Progress without memory is a second flood waiting to happen. In those words, Banqiao transcended its geography. It became universal, a lesson for every society trying to outrun the limits of nature. Meanwhile, Henan's countryside continued to flourish. The valley where the flood once roared had turned golden with wheat. Villages were rebuilt, bridges strong and wide, the air alive with birdsong. To a traveller, there was no visible sign of the catastrophe. Yet if one lingered long enough, subtle details emerged. An old foundation buried beneath new soil, a line of trees planted perfectly straight where homes once stood, or the way locals still left offerings at the river after the first summer storm. In those gestures, the past remained present. At dusk, the rebuilt Banqiao Dam reflected the sky like a vast mirror. Its surface shimmered with quiet strength, yet those who lived nearby said it never truly slept. The river, they believed, remembered everything, not to punish, but to remind. On the warm evenings of August, families gathered by the water, their reflections mingling with the stars above. They no longer feared the river. They spoke softly to it, thanking it for sparing them, forgiving it for taking others. And as the night wind carried their voices across the water, it seemed to whisper back, not in words, but in the timeless rhythm of waves returning home. In 2028, a quiet milestone passed, 53 years since the night Banqiao broke. There were no official ceremonies, yet the story was alive in ways its survivors could never have imagined. A new generation of filmmakers and digital historians had transformed the tragedy into an interactive documentary, merging data, animation, and testimony into something closer to meditation than report. Viewers navigated through a living map of the floodplain, each click revealing voices of those long gone, a mother calling for her son, a soldier describing the rescue boats, an engineer whispering that he knew the dam wasn't ready. The project, shared freely online, reached millions within weeks. It was history reimagined, personal, haunting, and deeply human. In Henan, the landscape continued to heal. Forests had grown thick along the riverbanks, and birds once absent from the region returned in flocks. Farmers said the soil had become richer with time, as if the land itself had absorbed its pain and turned it into renewal. They called it the second harvest, a quiet acknowledgement that life always finds a way to rise through loss. Yet even amid the beauty, locals carried reverence. They did not picnic near the old dam. They did not swim in its waters. The river was sacred ground, a living grave and a living teacher. That same year, an elderly poet from Jumadian published a final collection titled The River Remembers Everything. It contained no political accusations, no direct mention of Banqiao, yet every line pulsed with its memory. One poem read, "I walked where the water once stood, and the silence greeted me like kin. It said, I do not drown, I return." The book was quietly celebrated in literary circles, winning an award abroad. When asked about his inspiration, the poet said, "I wanted to write a story that doesn't need to be told to be felt." His words echoed the essence of the flood itself, an event that transcended language. Beyond China, Banqiao had entered classrooms and museums. In global exhibits about human resilience, its story was told beside Hiroshima, Bhopal and Chernobyl, not as comparison, but as kinship. The common thread was always the same, how fragile structures become when truth is ignored. Yet what set Banqiao apart was its eventual grace, the way those who survived chose remembrance over resentment, rebuilding not in defiance of nature, but in harmony with it. As the anniversary month ended, rain returned to Henan. It came softly, like a memory revisiting an old home. The sound against the roofs was rhythmic, almost kind. Children watched it from doorways, tracing raindrops with their fingers. For them, the flood was a story told in whispers, not a wound. For the elders, it was proof that healing does not mean forgetting. It means learning to live alongside what once broke you. And as the river swelled gently under the night sky, the people of Banqiao felt a quiet truth settle in their hearts, that the past, when honoured, does not haunt, it guides. By 2029, the Banqiao story had become part of a larger global narrative about resilience and remembrance. Universities around the world taught it not as a tragedy alone, but as an essential chapter in understanding humanity's relationship with nature. In climate summits, experts reference Banqiao alongside other historic collapses, emphasizing how knowledge born from disaster saves lives in the present. For the first time, Chinese and international researchers collaborated on an open archive of hydrological data from the 1975 flood. It was a gesture of shared transparency, a sign that truth, once buried, had finally found common ground. In Henan, the once feared river now ran calm and bright. The valley, once a sea of death, had become one of China's most fertile regions. New towns stood where mud and ruin had once been, filled with light, laughter, and the sound of commerce. Yet the people still remembered. They always would. When asked by visitors how they could live beside the same river that had destroyed their ancestors' homes, one local man smiled and said, "You don't turn your back on the water. You learn its language." His words carried the quiet wisdom of generations, a truth deeper than science could measure. As the 54th anniversary approached, artists and citizens began planning a small permanent memorial. Not a statue, not a monument of stone, but a garden, a circular space overlooking the reservoir, filled with willows, wildflowers, and engraved stones naming each of the lost villages. The project had no government funding, yet donations poured in from across the country. Volunteers travelled from cities to help plant trees, their hands sinking into the same earth their grandparents once fled. When the garden opened, it was simple, understated, and breathtaking. The wind through the trees sounded almost like running water. A plaque at the entrance read, "For those carried away, and for those who carried on." Visitors walked through in silence. Some wept, some smiled. Children played along the paths, their laughter echoing softly through the branches. It was not a place of grief, but of peace, a space where nature and memory finally coexisted. Each spring the flowers bloomed brighter, and the locals said it was the river's way of remembering with them. International media covered the story of the memorial, calling it China's Garden of Healing. The world saw a nation acknowledging its past through beauty, not shame. And within China, for the first time, even official outlets reported openly on Banqiao, the storm, the collapse, the courage. No longer a forbidden story, it had become a shared inheritance. The dam that once symbolized hubris now stood beside a garden that symbolized humility. And as dusk fell over the valley, lanterns glowed among the trees, reflecting in the water below like small, steadfast stars. Reminders that even after the longest silence, light always returns to the river. The year 2030 marked 55 years since the night the Banqiao Dam gave way. Half a century of silence, rediscovery, and reconciliation. The world had changed, but the lessons born in that valley still pulsed beneath its surface. On a warm August evening, the new memorial garden filled again. Families gathered with candles and paper lanterns, as they did every year now. But this time there was something different, a sense of closure. Children ran through the willow trees, tracing their fingers along the engraved stones of forgotten villages. Their grandparents watched from benches, their faces calm, their eyes reflecting the same river that once terrified them. The air was heavy with the scent of flowers and rain. No speeches were made, none were needed. The silence itself had become sacred. As twilight deepened, the first lanterns were set afloat on the river. The water caught their glow, carrying hundreds of small flames downstream. Some drifted alone, others gathered into clusters, glowing softly like constellations reborn on the surface of the earth. The river shimmered. The same river that had once destroyed everything now held the light of those who endured. The scene was both sorrow and grace. Old songs were hummed quietly, their words lost to time but their meaning clear. We are still here. Across the world, millions watched through live streams shared by visitors. The sight of the floating lanterns spread far beyond Henan, reaching people who had never heard of Banqiao before. Journalists wrote about the river of remembrance, calling it a moment when history finally breathed freely. The comments beneath the videos came from every language imaginable. People expressing grief, respect, awe. Many wrote simply, "Thank you for remembering." Others said, "We will remember too." The tragedy that had once been hidden had become something universal, not just China's sorrow, but humanity's reflection. That night, as the last lights disappeared into darkness, an old man near the shore whispered to his grandson, "Do you hear it?" The boy listened. At first, there was only the soft rush of the current and the hum of cicadas. Then, faintly, the river's rhythm deepened, steady, endless, like the sound of breathing. "It's the water," the old man said. "It remembers." And for a moment it truly seemed alive, as though the river itself carried the weight of every story told, every silence broken, every lesson learned. When dawn came, the valley glowed gold under the rising sun. Mist lifted over the reservoir, revealing a landscape reborn yet rooted in memory. The Banqiao Dam stood still, its reflection clear, unthreatening, a monument not of failure, but of humility. Along its banks the gardens swayed gently in the breeze, its flowers opening toward the light. For the people of Henan, and for the countless unseen souls carried by the river, peace had finally come. The story that began in darkness had ended in calm, not erased, not forgotten, but transformed. The flood had taken lives, but the memory of those lives had changed the world. And as the water flowed onward to the sea, it whispered the truth that outlasts all tragedy. What endures is not destruction, but remembrance.